All right. Let's see, we have some people coming in today on the call here. Great. Folks are being let in. So welcome, everyone. This is Matt Pickering at NQF. It's a pleasure to convene you all again, especially our CSAC members today as of July 26, 2022. This is the Consensus Standards Approval Committee, or our CSAC. This meeting is to evaluate the fall 2021 measure evaluation cycle. So there will be a series of measures that the CSAC will evaluate today, as well as listen to some of the proceedings that happen from our standing committees or the respective standing committees. We have co-chairs that will be present, as well as our CDP directors in addition. So again, thank you all for your attendance, as well as our CSAC members as we get into our proceedings today. But before I do, we'll go to the next slide. I did just want to offer an opportunity for others to provide their welcoming remarks to this group as well. First, I would like to hand it over to our CEO, Dana Gelb-Safran, to provide her welcoming remarks to the CSAC for the proceedings today. Dana?
Thanks so much, Matt. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to spend a few minutes with all of you this morning. As Matt's outlined, the primary discussion topics today will be an overview of measures being reviewed as part of the fall 21 cycle, including recommendations from the CDP standing committees. In reviewing this agenda, I am reminded of the extraordinary amount of effort and time and preparation that goes into these meetings on the part of the committees, on the part of the committee co-chairs, the CSAC members, the staff, the CSAC co-chairs. And as a former CSAC member myself from 2013 to 2017, I do understand the critical role that CSAC plays, and just wanted to offer my sincere appreciation to each and every one of you, and of course to our CSAC co-chairs and to the staff. There's been quite a lot of work that the team has been doing to continue to evolve, streamline, make more efficient, and just make more effective our measure review processes. I'll share that, I'm almost at my 1-year anniversary in my role here at NQF. And one of the things I spent quite a bit of time on in my early weeks was about 100 interviews with stakeholders to learn what they had to say about NQF, but in particular, what they had to say about the consensus development process and what works about it and what could be better about it. And through that, I heard quite a lot about ways that we could streamline things and improve things, including in the role that CSAC plays, in the role that our scientific methods panel plays, and the ways that those groups work together with our CDP committees. The team since that time has also done quite a lot to meet with measure developers, with standing committee members, with measure stewards, scientific methods panel, with you, the CSAC, to really round out their perspectives on how to streamline, improve the CDP process. One of the changes has been the implementation of the consent calendar process that's being used today, as well as the use of a CSAC discussion guide that consolidates hundreds of pages of CSAC meeting materials into one document that for this cycle, as I understand it, is less than 20 pages. So that I hope is making a big difference, but you'll hear more from the team over the course of the day about the kinds of changes being implemented, and we will look for your ongoing engagement with us and feedback to us as we continue to improve upon this process and the overall process for endorsement and maintenance of measures. We are so proud and humbled at the opportunity that we have had for over 2 decades to lead that process on behalf of CMS and for the country. And at this moment in history where measurement has never been more critical and central to healthcare, from the work in value-based payment to commitments around improving health equity, to ongoing efforts to reduce avoidable harm, none of this is possible without measurement and without advancing to a next generation of measures. So our work here is so extremely important, and I thank all of you sincerely for all that you do. Missy Danforth, thank you for your ongoing leadership and chairwomanship of the CSAC. So let me turn it back to you, Matt, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dana. And I also echo a lot of Dana's remarks to the CSAC, and thank you all for your time and attention, as always, to this work, especially with how we're engaging you moving forward in new areas of efficiency, such as looking at this consent calendar process. So thank you all very much. Before we begin, I'd like to also turn it over to our chair, Missy Danforth, to provide some welcoming remarks as well. So Missy.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. I want to start today by thanking the NQF staff. They've done really an incredible job, I think, taking feedback from this group and other stakeholders. And you're going to see a lot of that in what Dana described today and how we're going to run today's meeting. I'm also going to thank you in advance for your patience. This is our first time trying this new consent calendar format. And I think we've done a lot of prep work to make sure it goes smoothly, but thank you in advance for your patience as we work through in real time any bugs. We are missing today the greatest co-chair and my wingman, John Bolger, so he can take a much earned vacation in Europe with his family. Hopefully it's not too hot. But we are so grateful for all of you who are able to make it today and for your time today. So thank you so much. Thanks in advance for your patience, like I said, as we go through this new format. I'm going to also close with an apology. I have a very annoying ceiling fan that I cannot get out of my camera. I am working today out of my house in Maine that does not have air conditioning. And for some odd reason, we're also going through a heat wave. And so it's about 86 degrees in my house today. I tried it without the fan this morning, couldn't do it. I'm going to try throughout the day to keep the fan out of the camera, but apologize in advance if anyone's getting dizzy staring at it. But I hope you understand. It was like that, or literally just sweat pouring down as we move through the agenda today. So welcome. Thank you. Very excited to try this new format today. I'm going to turn it back over to Matt to explain how this is going to work.
Thank you so much, Missy. Appreciate you attending and hopefully staying somewhat cool where you are. I also just wanted to check in. I saw Kevin Kavanaugh. You had your hand raised briefly. Did you have a question, or were you just? Oh,
I was just a comment to point out that being down south, 86 is not a heat wave.
Kevin, I hear you. I'm in Florida, and it's 86.
I just wanted to clear that up. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Thank you. And again, thank you, Missy, for those comments, as well as Dana. So we're excited to roll through this meeting with you all today. So we'll go to the next slide. No hesitation here. Just a few housekeeping reminders for folks. Again, using this WebEx platform has video and audio capability. It's not new. It's not new to everyone on this call. We do kindly ask to put yourself on camera when you're talking to be a little bit more engaging. There'll be times where we're going to be taking the slides down and having just our little Hollywood squares up on the screen so we can all participate and engage within this work. So please go ahead and do that. And also keep yourself on mute if you're not talking. Just prevents any further background noise, as Missy has mentioned with her fan, which Missy, we didn't hear anything, at least I haven't, about the fan. So we do have the chat box as well, and the raise hand feature to be recognized. We'll keep an eye on the raise hand as well as the chat, if you so wish to use those, as I mentioned with Kevin Kavanaugh, I just did. There will be some meeting breaks, so we do have a lunch break scheduled around noon. We will keep to the reconvening at 12:30. Reason being is just because we also have folks that will probably be attending, developers, the members of the public, during the time slots we've allocated. So even if we break a little early, you may get more of a lunch break than already planned. We will still convene at 12:30, and we'll see if we need to squeeze in another break in the afternoon as needed. Member and public comment opportunities. There is and always the opportunity for members of the public to comment, both at the end of the meeting, so a comment of the overall proceedings, but we also have opportunities for the public to have comments as they're going through the measure discussions. So before the CSAC makes any decisions or final remarks, there's a consideration of the public comments as well for each one of the measure discussions we'll be having today, including the consent calendar. So if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can always reach out to us. If you're using the chat feature, you can reach out to NQF staff directly, or you can email the project box, and we have members of our team monitoring that as well if you have any technical difficulties. But thank you. We'll move right along to the next slide if we could. So here's our agenda for today. So we've done some welcoming and overview of what we'll be doing today. We'll then go into the roll call and disclosures of interest. So we'll go through that, and then we'll determine around if we have quorum at that point, and then we'll review the CSAC procedure and test vote for the proceedings today. That includes the consent calendar as well as the non-consent calendar discussions. We'll also then roll into the consideration of that consent calendar and see if there's any discussion from this CSAC. Again, the CSAC was provided an opportunity in advance of this call to review the measures on the consent calendar, to see if there's any concerns based on the criteria for the consent calendar. And we'll review all of those during that discussion. We then will have a lunch break, like I mentioned, reconvening at 12:30 sharp, 12:30 Eastern, that is, and then we'll go into discussion and voting on the non-consent calendar measures. So those are the ones that did not meet all of those criteria that we'll talk about here around the consent calendar measures. And then lastly, if any measures are pulled from the consent calendar today, they will be slotted into a reserved time slot at 2 p.m., 2 to 3, to discuss those measures. And if there's no measures being pulled from the consent calendar, we will cancel that time slot. And then public comment would move up, and then we will adjourn with next steps. Okay, going to the next slide. So I will now go into the roll call and disclosures of interest for today. So going to the next slide. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Roll call here for the team. So we also have this great team, the NQF staff that have been working behind the scenes to get everything ready for today, as well as working with the project teams to get everyone ready to go for today's proceedings. So you can see Elizabeth Dry, Trisha Elliott, myself, Matthew Pickering, Mike DeVecchia, Beth Flashner, Mary McCutcheon, and Kim Patterson. Thank you for all of your work, as always, behind the scenes. It's a lot of effort to get the meetings together. We'll go to the next slide, and we'll then go through roll call. So again, thank you all for your attendance today. Today we'll combine introductions with roll call, or excuse me, with disclosures of interest. So as a reminder, you received 2 disclosure of interest forms from us. One is an annual disclosure of interest, which goes out every year, just gaining your general, any potential conflicts of interest generally. And then we also have another form that's more specific to the measures that we are evaluating today in this current fall 2021 cycle. In those forms, we ask a number of questions about your professional activities, and today we'll ask you to verbally disclose any information provided on either of those forms that you believe is relevant to this committee's work. We are especially interested in grants, research, or consulting related to the committee's work today. Just a few reminders. You sit on this group as an individual. You do not represent the interests of your employer or anyone who may have nominated you for this committee. You are interested in, we are interested in any disclosures, both of paid and unpaid activities that are relevant to the work in front of you. And finally, just because you disclose does not mean you have a conflict of interest. We do verbal disclosures in the spirit of openness and transparency. Now, I'll go around our virtual table, starting with our committee co-chairs. I'll call your name, and please state your name, what organization you are with, and if you have anything to disclose. If you do not have any disclosures, please just state that I have nothing to disclose to keep the conversation moving. And if you experience trouble unmuting yourself, please just raise your hand so that one of our staff can assist you. Okay, going down the list, I'll start out with Missy Danforth.
Good morning, everyone. Missy Danforth from the Leapfrog Group, and I am an active member of the technical expert panel for 3 of the adult CT dose measures that we'll be discussing today. So I will be recusing myself from those measures. Thanks.
Thank you, Missy. And those would be measures 3633E, 3662E, and 3663E. Thank you. John Bulger, we know that he's not in attendance today. Dan Kulikula.
I meant it's Kulika.
Kulika, apologies, Dan.
No worries. Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody is fine. My name is Dan Kulika. I'm with the Medicaid program in the Health and Human Services Commission in Texas, in Austin, and I have nothing to disclose.
Thank you so much, Dan. Dana Sierra. Dana Sierra. Let's see, Dana, you're on the WebEx, but can't hear you. Maybe have one of our team members reach out. We'll circle back to Dana. So Lisa Freeman, you can see those on the screen. Her name is inactive. So Lisa has reached out to us just recently in the past 24 hours, and unfortunately has resigned from the CSAC due to some personal issues. So she's not able, she won't be on the call today and won't be on the CSAC moving forward. So she is now inactive. Kevin Kavanaugh.
Kevin Kavanaugh from Health Watch USA. I have no pertinent conflicts of interest with the metrics which are being reviewed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Rebecca Kirsch.
Good morning, Rebecca Kirsch with the National Patient Advocate Foundation, based in Washington, D.C., but I'm here in the beautiful North Carolina shore today. I have a technical expert panel position on a couple of the measures being discussed today where I will recuse myself. Otherwise, no other conflicts.
And thank you so much, Rebecca. And those measures are 3666, 3666, 3665, which are two measures on the consent calendar, and then 3667, which is a PCI measure not on the consent calendar. Thank you, Rebecca. Laura Pennington.
Hi, I'm Laura Pennington. I'm the Quality Measurement Improvement Manager with Washington State Healthcare Authority, which is the Medicaid organization, and I have nothing to disclose.
Great, thank you, Laura. And Ed Septimus. Ed Septimus. Okay, I think he told us he was not able to attend today. And Jeffrey Sussman, excuse me.
Yeah, Jeff Sussman. I'm Senior Associate Dean at University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, and I have nothing to disclose.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And Kelly Nedrow.
I am Kelly Nedrow. I'm the Senior Director for Health Issues for the American Federation of Teachers, Nurses, and Health Professionals, and I have nothing to disclose.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to circle back to Dana Sierra. Dana, are you online now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I'm online. I'm Dana Sierra. I work for Inclusa Incorporated, which is a managed care organization in Wisconsin, and I'm also a family caregiver. And I have nothing to disclose.
Great. Thank you so very much, Dana and everyone. So just to confirm, with the numbers that we have today, unfortunately, we are not going to have quorum for all of the measures today. So that means that offline voting is going to have to occur after the meeting. We are able to vote on one measure due to the no recusals of that measure. That one measure is 0097. That is the last measure we have in discussion currently today. There are no recusals on that measure, and given our numbers, which we're looking at 80% to be quorum for voting, we drop below quorum for the other patient safety measures and the PCCI measures. We would need 8 people, and we drop below that number with the recusals that we have with Missy and Rebecca. In addition, when we're looking at the consent calendar measures, Rebecca is also recused from 2 GPC measures in the consent calendar. So that means that those 2 measures would have to be voted on separately by the CSAC because of quorum. However, the other measures that are on the consent calendar, there are no recusals, so quorum is maintained. so we can discuss those measures. And if there are no objections, those measures will move forward as endorsed. Okay, so just again, we do not have quorum for all of the measures today. The only measure we have quorum for today is 0097, which will be voted on the call today if quorum is maintained. The other two measures, or the other three measures for patient safety, we do not have quorum because of recusals. So those measures will be voted offline. The PCCI measure, we do not have quorum because of recusals. So we will have to vote on that measure offline. And the two GPC measures in the consent calendar, 3666 and 3665, will also be voted offline due to recusals and those measures not having quorum today. Therefore, the other measures in the consent calendar will still be discussed, and if no objections from this group, we'll move forward as endorsed. Any questions from this group before we proceed?
What is our denominator and quorum today?
Right, so we had, so in total, we had 11, as you can see on the screen.
Right.
But with Lisa Freeman being inactive, that drops it down to 10. We have an 80% quorum number, which is 8 people to discuss the measures. However, with the recusals of Missy and Rebecca, our denominator drops from 10 to 9. So when we do 80% of 9, it's 7.2. So that means we would still need 8 people to vote, but with Missy and Rebecca recused, we are dropping below that 8 number.
Thank you for the explanation.
So one more time, that means 0097, we have no recusals for from this group today present on the call. We can vote today if we still maintain quorum with everyone here on those measures. The other 3 patient safety measures and the 1 PCCI measure that we were looking to discuss and vote on today would have to be voted offline. We can still discuss those, discuss the issues. The CDP directors and the co-chairs will still share their perspectives, but we will be voting on those measures offline. In addition, the 2 GPC measures in which Rebecca is recused, 3666 and 3665, will be voted offline out of the consent calendar. The other measures in the consent calendar can still be discussed, and if no objection, we'll move forward as endorsed, since there are no recusals on those measures and we maintain quorum for those measures today. Okay. Let's go ahead and proceed. All right. So we still will do a test vote. So earlier this morning, I'm doing a test vote again because of 0097. Earlier this morning, you should have received a Poll Everywhere link. So as we're going through the procedures today, you can go into your email, should have been sent this morning to find that Poll Everywhere link. Please do not share that link outside of anyone besides yourself, as this is a voting link for the measures. So as we proceed and we get to the test vote screen, there'll be a test vote question just to make sure everything's up and running for your Poll Everywhere link. But you should have received that this morning, so you can take a look in your emails. I'll go ahead and keep going to talk about the proceedings today. So we go to the next slide. Okay. So we talked about the consent calendar process. And so earlier this year, we convened the CSAC in an advisory meeting to talk through a lot of areas of efficiencies and improvements that can be implemented for this fall 2021 cycle. One was this consent calendar process, in which we are trying to move measures that do not have any issues or have a supermajority in the overall suitability for endorsement vote from standing committees into a consent calendar in order to focus the CSAC's discussions and proceedings today on measures that had potential process issues or areas of where the measures are close call for voting, if you will, for further consideration of this CSAC to make sure that processes were followed and criteria were applied appropriately. So we thank the CSAC very much for their willingness to roll through with this consent calendar process. And thus we are doing that for this reduced measure cycle. So as you saw in the materials, we have 13 measures for this cycle. So this is an opportunity for us to pilot these types of processes. So thank you to the CSAC for the willingness to pilot this. So the consent calendar includes only measures that were recommended for endorsement by the standing committee, and they meet a series of criteria that are on slide 12, but also page 4 of the discussion guide. So a measure must meet all of those criteria in order to be on the consent calendar. Again, that's a supermajority of overall suitability for endorsement vote of greater than 80%. So that means only measures that are recommended for endorsement are on the consent calendar. Those measures that are not recommended for endorsement are not on the consent calendar, and those measures that are less than that 80% overall suitability for endorsement vote are also not on the consent calendar. Those non-consent calendar measures will be discussed and voted on separately by the CSAC as measures that did not meet one or more of those criteria that I've mentioned that are on page 4 of the discussion guide or on slide 12 of the deck today. The consent calendar process allows the CSAC to focus discussions and consideration of those measures due to concerns or issues that have been identified. And those concerns or issues would map back to those key consideration criteria and ultimately reflect issues related to the consensus development process. Okay, going to the next slide. So the consent calendar was shared with this CSAC in advance of this meeting. So prior to the meeting for your consideration and review of those measures, given all of those criteria, again, that we'll go through here in a little bit. But you had, the CSAC was given 5 days to request to pull any of those measures from the consent calendar and have a rationale based on the key consideration criteria not being met. So again, those key consideration criteria are found on page 4 of the discussion guide, as well as slide 12 of this deck. Any request from a CSAC member must be submitted to the NQF staff or CSAC chairs to pull a measure. And if a measure is pulled for discussion, NQF would have notified the developers as well as the standing committee co-chairs and project teams of the measure being pulled. And the CSAC member requesting to pull that measure would have served as lead discussant. I can say that as of today, none of the CSAC members have requested to pull measures off the consent calendar in advance of this meeting. However, if a measure was to be pulled for discussion along with that rationale, we would update the materials and reflect any changes and resend those materials back out to the CSAC. However, like I mentioned, no measures were pulled from the consent calendar. So the measures listed there are what was originally had sent out to the CSAC. Again, no measures were pulled leading up to this meeting. Going to the next slide. So here are the key consideration criteria for inclusion onto the consent calendar. And as discussed, measures will not be discussed if they meet all of these following criteria. So they are included in this consent calendar if they meet all of these criteria. So they will not be discussed separately. They must receive an 80% or greater passing vote on the overall suitability for endorsement. So like I mentioned, that's a supermajority. So that is an endorsement vote, approving endorsement. So they must receive that supermajority vote. They also must not have any process concerns that have been identified that may have affected the endorsement decision. So any process concerns that may have affected the endorsement decision that must not have occurred in order to be on the consent calendar. Also, no reconsideration requests were received on that measure, either by the standing committee, like during post-comment considerations, or by the CSAC, as it's another opportunity for developers to submit a reconsideration request for CSAC consideration. And I'm going to also report that no reconsideration requests were also submitted to NQF or this CSAC in advance of this meeting. The standing committee also accepted the scientific methods panel rating. So this criterion is if there's no overturning of the S&P's decision related to the measures that were evaluated this cycle. For number 5, no new information received through public comment that was not available or discussed during the standing committee's measure evaluation meeting, which is conflicting to the standing committee's recommendation. So no new information was received through public comment that conflicts with the standing committee's rating or decision making on a measure. Also, measures are included in the consent calendar if they are not pulled for discussion by a CSAC member. So again, looking at the measures in advance of this call, no CSAC members pulled a measure. So thus the measures in the consent calendar are also have not been pulled by a CSAC member. And lastly, no additional concerns identified that require CSAC discussion. And this is based on the CSAC decision-making rationale, which is posted online and readily available for anyone's review. But those rationale also include mentions of just consistency and evaluation of measures, as well as just being consistent with the CDP process. Any further questions on this before we move forward? Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So during the meeting, so today, for the measure evaluation discussions today, the NQF project staff, myself included, will first provide an overview of the measures on the consent calendar, noting any measures that were pulled for discussion prior to the meeting. The CSAC chair or vice chair, which in this case it would be Missy, will then ask if any CSAC member wishes to pull a measure for discussion, giving another opportunity for today if you wish to pull a measure off the consent calendar. The CSAC member that wants to pull a measure must present clear and compelling rationale for pulling the measure, which must relate to the key consideration criteria, which we previously discussed, and it's also on page 4 of your discussion guide. And the CSAC member wishing to pull it will also become the lead discussant for that measure during an allocated time slot today, which is again reserved for 2 to 3 p.m. So if you wish to pull a measure and you have clear, compelling rationale as to why it didn't meet one of those criteria that we went through just in the previous slide, it would be moved to a 2 to 3 p.m. hour for discussion, and the CSAC member who wished to pull the measure will be the lead discussant for that measure and discussing any issues during that time period. So the CSAC chair or vice chair, after all of those discussions are heard, will then ask the members of the public if they have any comments on the measures within the consent calendar. And going to the next slide. If quorum is present, the CSAC chair or vice chair will then ask if there are any objections to accepting the standing committee's endorsement recommendations for the measures on the consent calendar. So again, this is not a vote. It is an approval of the consent calendar through no objection. If no objections, and it just takes one member, the recommendations are accepted and no voting on endorsement is needed. So those measures, again, being endorsed from the standing committee, if no objections, the endorsement will stand. The CSAC endorses those measures on the consent calendar. And again, just a reminder, right, it's only 80% or greater passing votes for overall suitability beyond the consent calendar. So it's only measures that are endorsed from the standing committee. If quorum is not present, CSAC members will vote offline on each measure under review for those measures in which quorum is not met. And as I stated, Rebecca Kirsch is recused from 3666 and 3665. Those two measures will be voted separately offline by the CSAC. And if there's no objections to the consent calendar measures, the other measures will move forward as being endorsed, except for 3666 and 3665, which would have to be voted on separately outside of this meeting. Going to the next slide. So the non-consent calendar measures. So there are measures that did not meet all of those criteria, so they are pulled for discussion and review by the CSAC. And so following the consent calendar discussions and after we come back from our lunch break, the CSAC will then proceed to review and vote on the measures that require discussion, as they do not meet any of those criteria, one or more. For these measures, the respective NQF team and the co-chairs will also provide an overview of the measure, highlighting the issues of why it's being pulled for discussion by the CSAC, and the standing committee co-chairs will share their perspectives, and then the CSAC will have the opportunity to ask any clarifying questions through lead discussant and discussant discussions before moving to a vote on each measure separately. And the CSAC will be asked if they wish to uphold the standing committee's recommendation, so accepting the standing committee's recommendation to either endorse or not endorse a measure, or do not accept the standing committee's recommendation and return that measure back for further consideration by the standing committee. So this is the outcome of the votes that the CSAC has normally done in the past. Going to the next slide. Now, measures being pulled from the consent calendar during the meeting today. So again, we're going to discuss the consent calendar measures. If a member wishes to pull with a rationale as why it didn't meet one or more of those criteria, that measure will be moved to an allocated time slot today, which has been allocated from 2 to 3 p.m. today. So measures that are pulled will be slotted into that time slot. And for each pulled measure, the respective project team staff, the director of the team overseeing that measure, and the standing committee co-chairs will again present the measure, the issue that the CSAC member has called attention to, The standing committee chair will provide their perspectives. The CSAC chair will then ask the member who pulled the measure to lead the discussion on those issues. We'll then open it up to see if the other CSAC members have anything to discuss. And then the standing committee co-chairs will provide any responses to relevant concerns, and then they'll be moving to a vote. So following those discussions, each measure that is pulled will also have a vote. And the vote again is to accept the standing committee's decision or to turn it back to the standing committee. Okay, moving to the next slide. All right, so now we're going to do a test vote again because we are still able to vote on 0097. So please locate that Poll Everywhere link, and we'll go ahead and do this test vote, and I'll turn it over to Mary and Beth to run through that.
Good morning, everyone. Mary will be pulling up the Poll Everywhere. So our question today is, do you prefer tea or coffee? And your choices are tea or coffee. And if you don't drink either, please choose one so we can see you know how to vote. I see 7. We're looking for 8. Is someone having trouble finding the link? Take your time, we're running slightly ahead. 8. I'm seeing 8 votes. Mary, please close the poll. Coffee is the big winner today. So 6 prefer coffee and 2 prefer tea. And that would be a passing vote if this was a vote on a measure. But please enjoy your coffee and your tea. Any questions about voting?
Are you sponsored by Starbucks?
No, unfortunately not.
No, and we probably could give everyone Starbucks coffee for our meetings. Okay. All right, great. I think we can close that down. Looks like everyone's up and running on that. So fantastic. So just before we go into our consent calendar discussions, just wanted to make sure, does anyone have any other questions related to how this is going to run today? Okay. Okay, great. Thanks, Missy, and thank you all. So we'll go to the next slide. So again, this is now talking about the consent calendar measures that are in the discussion guide. Okay.
Matt,
yes.
This is Beth. We are running a little bit ahead of schedule, and we've told like developers and co-chairs that this would start around 11. So I'm not sure if we still want to.
Yeah, I think we can keep going. We'll discuss the consent calendar measures, and we may have to take a break, obviously for the lunch period. And so just for everyone, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, on this slide here. So after the consent calendar discussions, as Beth has raised, you know, we've informed our CSAC, or excuse me, our co-chairs of our standing committees and developers about this consent calendar discussions happening at this time, if they so wish to attend. However, we would then be sharing the outcomes of the consent calendar discussions via email to those stakeholders, informing them of the final outcome. So that being if measures are not pulled, and that 2 to 3 o'clock hour would be canceled, or if measures are pulled, which measures they are and what the rationale was we'll share that out with them so they know to attend that 2 to 3 o'clock hour if needed. Again, if nothing is pulled, we will inform the group or inform those stakeholders that nothing is pulled from the consent calendar, those measures are moving forward as endorsed, and that the 2 to 3 o'clock hour will be canceled and public comment will be moved up. So we'll proceed to go through the consent calendar today and go through that process of discussion if there's no objections. And if not, we will move forward and we'll break for lunch, which may be a longer lunch than what we had allocated for, but we just wanted to make sure we had enough space for everyone to discuss, ask questions if needed, but then we'll break for lunch and come back at 12:30. Okay, thanks, Beth. So this is just an overview of the consent calendar. And for those following along on the discussion guide, That is now going to be page 5. And page 5 in the discussion guide lists both consent calendar measures and non-consent calendar, but as a general overview here on this slide, for the total number of measures for fall 2021 was 13 measures. Again, this is a reduced number of measures cycle. And the reasons for that was because NQF was also receiving a lot of emails and responses from developers when seeking if they're intending to submit measures for fall 2021, still recognizing the issues and the difficulties of data and resource allocation to support measure maintenance endorsement due to COVID-19. So NQF, working with those stakeholders, recognize that this is still an ongoing issue. We reached out to other measure developers asking if this was still an issue that they are grappling with, and thus the responses were resounding yes, and also requesting to move measures to a different cycle. So NQF did a lot of work to move measures from fall 2021 to future cycles that will be coming down the pipeline, and that's why we have a reduced number of measures this cycle. This also gave NQF opportunity to pilot these new processes, such as this consent calendar approach with a reduced number of measures. But this is why we have 13, just so CSAC is fully aware of this. 10 of those measures are new measures, and 3 of those measures are maintenance measures. In the consent calendar, again, those measures meeting all of those criteria that I stated previously, we have 8 measures. 6 of those are new, and 2 of those are maintenance. And as just one more reminder, all of those measures have been recommended for endorsement with an over 80% threshold rating. So they recommended overall suitability for endorsement with more than 80% of the standing committees in favor of that decision, recommending that. For the non-consent calendar measures, meaning they did not meet 1 or more of those criteria, there are 5 measures. 4 of those are new and 1 is maintenance. As far as measures being pulled for discussion, again, prior to the CSAC meeting, so in that 5-day review of the consent calendar measures, no CSAC member requested to pull a measure for discussion today prior to the meeting. As I mentioned, after the discussions today, we will send out an email to developers and standing committee co-chairs to let them know of the outcomes of the decisions on the consent calendar today. So Mary, if we can just go to the page 5 of the discussion guide, we can see those measures fully listed there. There we go. Thanks, Mary. So as you can see, this is the consent calendar. You have really the measures in the consent calendar on this tealish blue left column, whereas the measures not on the consent calendar are on the right column. So you can see of all of the GPC, or the geriatrics and palliative care measures, all of those measures reviewed by that standing committee are on the consent calendar. They meet all of those criteria that we previously reviewed. So there's a supermajority here, no process concerns identified, no overturning of any S&P voting, no reconsideration requests, et cetera. So all of those measures are listed there. There are 3 new measures. Same thing for surgery. So surgery only had 1 measure come through this cycle because we did have a reduced cycle, but that measure also met all of the criteria and thus being on the consent calendar. For primary care and chronic illness, there are 2 measures that are on the consent calendar, both of those, or 1 being new, 1 being maintenance. And there's 1 measure not on the consent calendar, and that's 3667. In addition, you can see a little 1 next to that title of 3667 in a bracket. That is to map back to the key consideration criteria. So stakeholders, our CSAC members, but also others who are looking at this discussion guide, can see which criterion was not met for this measure. In this case, this measure did not meet the 80% threshold, and that's why it's included in the consent calendar. Moving to patient safety, of the measures reviewed for patient safety, only 2 are on the consent calendar. 1 is a maintenance and 1 is new, where we have 4 not on the consent calendar. We have 3 measures that are very similar, just at different levels of analysis. So you can see 3633E, 3662E, and 3663E. And it's a lot of numbers being a mouthful. You can see those are all new measures, same measure, different level of analysis, and you can see the criterion or criteria that were not met, and that's why they're included on the non-consent calendar list. So for that first measure, 1 and 2, 1 again is not meeting the 80% threshold. It still could be recommended for endorsement, which in this case it is recommended for endorsement. It just did not meet that 80% overall suitability for endorsement vote by the standing committee. And then you can see number 2 on all these other measures, there are some additional concerns that have been identified that require the CSAC's review and consideration. Lastly, 0097, you can see here, also did not meet criterion 1 and criterion 2. And this measure, if this CSAC does recall, was not fully evaluated by the CSAC back in fall 2020. You see that little asterisk under the table here indicating that it was originally evaluated in fall 2020. It was not brought to the CSAC's consideration for endorsement or non-endorsement. However, it was informed to the CSAC that this measure did come through in the cycle, but due to voting errors on validity, it was not going to be considered for the CSAC or by the CSAC during fall 2020. Instead, it would be moved to fall 2021 once those voting errors have been adjudicated, and it was brought back to the Patient Safety Standing Committee this past cycle. So our project team, our director, Tammy Funk, will go ahead and disclose that further when we get to that portion of the meeting today. But just calling it out here that this measure, again, was originally evaluated in fall 2020. It had some voting errors that were identified leading up to CSAC. Thus, it was not fully evaluated by CSAC, but the plan to bring it back to CSAC was, and CSAC did agree to this plan on bringing this measure back for fall 2021 CSAC. So like I said, we'll go through that when we get to that discussion today, but that is the only measure that we'll be able to vote online today. The other measures, we will be voting offline. And for the consent calendar measures, the 2 GPC measures, 3666 and 3665, will also be voted on separately. And the no objections discussion will happen for the other measures remaining on the consent calendar. Sorry, I'm stating that a lot. I just want to make sure we're all getting it and sinking in. Okay. So with this, what I'll do now is provide this overview of our consent calendar. I will now turn it over to Missy, who will facilitate the discussion and provide any thoughts on the consent calendar list and go through this process and see if anyone wishes to pull a measure for discussion later on today. Keep in mind that if you do wish to pull, it must map back to those key consideration criteria, must be a clear rationale as to why, in order to pull it for the discussion from 2 to 3 p.m. And you as a CSAC member wishing to pull it would be the lead discussant. Okay, Missy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Matt. So before I actually ask the question about pulling measures from the consent calendar, I want to first ask my CSAC colleagues if they have any questions about the criteria for including measures on the left side of this chart that Matt just outlined, that again are on slide number 12, or any questions in general about the new process that Matt just outlined. I think he did a great job in providing a lot of detail, but I do understand it's a lot of information. And it is the first time we're trying this new process today. So I'm going to pause for a second just to see if anyone has any questions about the criteria for these measures that they met to be on the consent calendar, or any questions about the process that we're about to start.
Miss, it's Dan. I have my hand up, but I have just a quick question. I'm sure that Matt covered in his wonderful presentation, but just to be sure, for the voting, for the measures that we will be voting today and the next offline, I don't remember what's the percentage to pass.
Great question, Dan. Matt, can you review that again?
Yeah, passing to pass. So for CSAC, the passing vote on a measure is 66%. So of those voting today, for passing a measure must be more than 66% of the voters voting to pass the measure. Is 66%.
It's above 60%.
Oh, excuse me, it's 60%, Dan. So 60% to pass the measure.
Thank you.
60% is our passage rate for most things at the committee level, correct?
So yes, it would be, well, for the committee level, it's 66%, correct?
No, 60%, isn't it?
No, sorry, yes, 60%. I apologize. Percentage is going on in my head. It is 60% at the committee level, 60% for this group. I apologize for that confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah. So the one that we'll be voting on today, hopefully, if everyone can stay on for the full call to pass, we'll be looking for like 5 out of 8 since our denominator is 8 today. But again, when we vote online, the number required to pass will change because we are expecting additional people to be able to vote online. But that's a great question, Dan. Anything else before I get started? And again, please don't hesitate if you have a question, because I do realize it's a lot of information.
So Missy, this isn't perhaps an issue about the new process, which I think is great to pilot and try out and will help streamline things. But we're getting relatively small numbers now at CSAC. And I wonder if now or sometime later on, you can talk about what the intent is. It seems like we've really slimmed down here. And I worry that we don't have the breadth of perspectives that we should have as CSAC, or as people are unable to attend, we get down to a pretty small number. Thanks.
Yeah,
And Missy, oh, sorry, Missy. I was going to add, Jeff, great comment, and we do recognize that. So after today, I mean, obviously we meet with the CSAC on strategic meetings. We would like to do sort of a debrief or lessons learned, as well as to think about what's to come in the pipeline ahead, because that will be a number that the CSAC is more familiar with. And so we want to make sure that through this pilot, are there other things that maybe we need to consider based on the CSAC's perspective related to the criteria, related to just the process itself, that maybe the CSAC would have liked to see something this way versus this way. The reduced number of measures, Jeff, you're right. This is not really the full perspective of what we normally see. However, it does provide us that opportunity to pilot this, and also for the CSAC to really dig in and see if there's a ways to improve the criteria or the process moving forward for the measures that we.
Yeah. Matt, just to clarify, I'm not talking about the number of measures, which I think is very important.
Apologies.
I was talking about the number of CSAC members.
Yeah.
Sorry, members, not measures. Got it.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's Zoom or whatever. How can you hear? But yeah, my sense is we've gotten to such a small group that I worry that we're no longer as representative as we should be, and that we have an increasingly small number. I mean, in this case, we could have 5 to look at and approve a measure, which seems to be getting pretty slim.
And great comments too, Jeff, and thank you. We do recognize where we are today with the quorum issues, and we certainly will be looking to see how we can increase our size of our CSAC, or ways that we can make sure that we don't run into some of these situations moving forward. But I appreciate the comments, Jeff. And it is something that for NQF, we continue to think about how we make sure that our committees are representative, and we do have quorum, especially given where we are currently in this virtual environment. But thank you, Jeff, for the comment.
Yes, thanks so much. Okay, I don't see any additional hands up. I just did my scan. That means that, as I suspected, Matt and the entire team did a great job laying this all out for us. So I will now ask the magic question. Are there any CSAC members that would like to pull a measure from the consent calendar? And again, you're looking at the left side of that table in that teal blue column. Okay, I see no hands. I see nothing in the chat. So I will move us on.
And before we move on, Missy, sorry, we do public comment to see if there's any members from the public. And so once more, if there's any members of the public on the line, you now have the opportunity to provide any comments to the measures on the consent calendar, which is those measures on that left column, as Missy has said. You can raise your hand, and we will recognize you as the order that we see your hand raised. No comments. Missy, turn it back to you.
Okay. I then am going to, because there are no objections, the measures will be confirmed to have CSAC endorsement. And Matt, will you announce the measures that are endorsed?
Yes. So thank you all very much for your consideration of the consent calendar measures. So as a reminder, those measures that are endorsed now, I'll start from the bottom up. For patient safety, NQF number 0689, NQF number 3636 will be endorsed. Primary care and chronic illness, or PCCI, NQF number 3661 and NQF number 3332 will be endorsed. Surgery, NQF number 3639, also receiving endorsement. And for GPC, just the one measure, 3645, receiving endorsement. Again, due to Rebecca's recusal for the other two measures, NQF number 3665 and 3666 will be voted offline by the CSAC through a survey monkey that will be sent out later for the CSAC's review. So for those on the call today, for your CSAC members on the call, just keep in mind your vote. It's hearing that you had no objections. When you get those that survey monkey for 3665 and 3666, since you had no objections, you would just vote to endorse those measures, and that will satisfy that survey item. Okay. Well, fantastic. So with that, we are ahead of schedule, quite a bit ahead of schedule. We just wanted to make sure we had enough time for folks to go through the consent calendar, have some discussions as needed. But it's great to see that the process went pretty well. So we will break for lunch at this time. So we are now at 11 a.m. Eastern. Our lunch is at 12:30. So we will give an hour-and-a-half lunch, just because we need to reserve that time for other stakeholders to be in attendance in the afternoon. So hour and a half, we will convene back at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, and NQF staff will be sending out email confirmations to those stakeholders, developers, and standing committee co-chairs, notifying them that the 2 to 3 o'clock hour will be canceled and public comment will be moved up. And one last thing before we let you go, if at any point in time later on in the afternoon, you need to step away for anything, please just let us know. You can message the team directly through Teams chat or send an email to us, just so that we can continue to monitor our numbers, because we still have to have quorum for 0097, which is later on in the afternoon. It's the last measure being discussed. And we also need to monitor numbers just to ensure that we have enough to have the call today. So just please let us know in advance if you need to step away. And if you know the time, that would also be helpful as well, to let us know the time you will need to step away and return. Oh, Kevin, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Well, a comment. If possible, why don't we move the measure that we have the quorum for up first, to make sure that we have a quorum and get that measure voted upon?
That's a great suggestion.
We
Kevin.
may not be able to do it, but you got an hour and a half to contact people.
Yep.
And, you know, that way at least we'll get that one done.
That's a great suggestion, Kevin. Does anyone from the CSAC have any objections to that approach?
No, that's a great idea. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, no guarantee. So what we'll do is reach out to our project team for that measure, which is the patient safety team, and then we'll have to reach out to the subsequent co-chairs and developers to see if they're able to attend. But we'll circle back when we get closer to the meeting time at 12:30, or announce that decision at 12:30 when we reconvene. Thank you, Kevin, for that suggestion. Any other comments or questions?
We've had a couple additional people join the call. Would you mind just repeating what the outcome of the consent calendar was for those individuals?
Sure. So just for those who have joined the call, the CSAC has completed their consent calendar discussion and review. Since we had recusal for two of the measures in the consent calendar, 3666 and 3665, those two measures we did not have quorum for, so those two measures were not considered in the consent calendar, and they will be voted on separately offline due to not having quorum for those measures due to a recusal. For the remaining measures in the consent calendar, those measures were not pulled for discussion. Therefore, there were no objections from the CSAC on those measures, and those measures will move forward as being endorsed as of today. Thank you, Beth, for mentioning that. One last call for any questions. Okay, we will reconvene at 12:30 p.m. Eastern sharp. Thank you all very much, and we'll be doing our end to start following up with directors, co-chairs, and developers. Thank you all. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
On the eastern side, so we're going to start up here in about 4 more minutes. But I see Missy is on the call. So Missy, I'm confirming that we were able to move around measures. So I'll announce this at the beginning at 12:30 when we kick back up, but we're moving the patient safety discussions to be first. So we'll start out with 0097, which Missy, you'll still be facilitating that. And then we'll go to the other 3 measures that you're recused on, and then I'll facilitate those discussions, and then we'll flip back to PCCI. And then going back to you, Missy, for facilitation on those, and then that will be the conclusion of our work today. And considering that we still have quorum for 0097, we will vote on 0097 today.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks.
So just see folks coming back online. It's 12:27 p.m. on the eastern side, so we're going to start back up here in about 3 more minutes. Kick off here in about another minute. All right. All right, it's 12:30 p.m. on the eastern side. We're going to pick back up and continue on. So Mary, if we can go to the next slide. Just want to welcome everybody back to the CSAC meeting today. Again, this is the CSAC for the fall 2021 measures, measure review cycle. As discussed earlier today, when we did a roll call, just wanted to let those who are attending now that we were not able to achieve quorum on a series of measures for review today with CSAC. The measures that we do have quorum for and thus will be voting on today is 0097. It's the only measure that we have quorum for voting. As far as the other measures on the not on the consent calendar list, those will be discussed today by the CSAC, as well as presentations from our CDP directors and co-chairs for those measures. But those measures will be voted offline. In addition, we did go through the consent calendar measures, and there were two measures also that we did not have quorum for. Those measures were NQF number 3666 and 3665. Those two measures were for the GPC Standing Committee. Those two measures will also be included in offline voting. Again, we didn't have quorum for those considerations. However, this CSAC agreed to move forward on the consent calendar for the other measures, which those measures remaining were endorsed earlier this morning through the consent calendar process. Lastly, before we go into now the non-consent calendar measures, we were able to move things around within our agenda, again, trying to keep to our quorum numbers. We're moving 0097, which is the one measure we have quorum for, and we'll vote today to be the first measure up for discussion. That's with the Patient Safety Standing Committee. We will then follow those discussions with the remaining Patient Safety Standing Committee measures, which are the 3 ECQMs. After the conclusion of those discussions, we will then move to the remaining measure, which is for PCCI, the Primary Care and Chronic Illness measure, which also we will discuss and for consideration. Lastly, before we go into all of this, I just wanted to remind folks that NQF is a nonpartisan organization. So out of mutual respect for each other, we kindly encourage that you make an effort to refrain from making any comments, innuendos, or humor relating to, for example, race, gender, politics, or topics that otherwise may be considered inappropriate during the meeting. While we encourage discussions that are open, constructive, and collaborative, let's all be mindful of how the language and opinions we have may be perceived by others. So with that, we can proceed. Are there any questions before we get started into our first measure discussions? Okay, so again, the first measure we have up is 0097 with the Patient Safety Standing Committee. I'm confirming that John James, one of our co-chairs, is on as well, but we will also have Tammy Funk presenting, but I'll turn it over to Missy just to sort of tee it up, and then we'll go to Tammy. Missy?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much again for coming back. We are going to be talking about one measure from the Patient Safety Standing Committee. Tammy is going to review that. So thank you so much, Tammy.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I will review our first patient safety measure, NQF 0097, medication reconciliation post-discharge. This is a maintenance process measure developed by the National Committee for Quality Assurance. This measure is being discussed right now because it did not receive 80% or greater passing votes for overall suitability for endorsement, and there was a process concern identified that may have affected the endorsement decision. This measure was first evaluated for maintenance by the Patient Safety Standing Committee during the fall 2020 cycle, and the reason it's coming back to the CSAC for fall 2021 consideration is due to a voting calculation error. So during the initial measure evaluation meeting, the measure votes for validity were incorrectly calculated, resulting in it being stated that the measure passed on validity when in fact the validity votes totaled a consensus not reached decision. The error was not discovered until after the post-comment call, but prior to the fall 2020 CSAC meeting. And at that point, it was too late to be rectified as a part of that cycle. During the fall 2020 CSAC meeting, the patient safety team and the co-chairs recommended, and the CSAC agreed, that the measure should retain endorsement until the Patient Safety Standing Committee could discuss and revote on validity and subsequently overall suitability for endorsement. This occurred during the spring 2022 cycle measure evaluation meeting that occurred last month in June of 2022. So NQF 0097 was discussed on June 28th, 2022 as part of the spring 2022 cycle, but just for validity and then overall suitability for endorsement. The standing committee had a discussion on validity and revoted and passed the measure on validity, and then also passed the measure on overall suitability for endorsement. During that discussion, the standing committee agreed that the validity testing showed positive correlations with related measures at a statistically significant level. The standing committee highlighted that the developer had also conducted face validity testing where the technical expert panel agreed with the measure's intent. The standing committee inquired about how medication reconciliation was assessed by the measure, and the developer clarified how the measure assesses medication reconciliation, and that and how it should be documented, and then responded to another concern about whether medication reconciliation was actually a surrogate of whether it was just performed or whether any discrepancies were actually detected. The standing committee had a long discussion about who performs medication reconciliation and how those various roles address and remediate any issues that are found. And the standing committee noted that medication reconciliation is actually a very complicated process, and so it may be more effective to create a second measure related to the reconciliation accuracy itself. The members overall noted that medication reconciliation and the measure in particular do drive actions by clinicians to assess medications, which are helpful in clinical care, and the standing committee passed the measure on validity and subsequently on overall suitability for endorsement. I'll now invite our standing committee co-chair, Dr. John James, to share his perspective on this measure.
Yeah, thank you, Tammy. The background on this measure is pretty colorful, but I think the committee went through the appropriate processes to resolve issues that sometimes came up after the meeting was over. One thing that gave some of us a little bit of confusion was the term reconciliation. Going in, I would have thought that would be reconciliation of the need for the medications against the list of medications that actually exist as the patient is discharged. In fact, what it is a list matching. Is the list at discharge the same as the list picked up by wherever the patient was discharged to? And so the Patient Safety Standing Committee thinks strongly that the developer needs to come forward and work on something that we might call genuine reconciliation, which is to get a team together and ensure that the right medications are being given to the patient to optimize their care, not just list matching. So thank you, Tammy. That's all I have to add.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, John. On CSAC, the lead discussant for this measure is Rebecca Kirsch. Rebecca, do you have anything additional?
Oh, sorry, Missy. I think it was Jeff. Jeff
Yeah,
Sussman.
I think you're wrong.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that, Jeff.
No problem. So first of all, I do think it's even more colorful than presented. In the fall of 2020, as I understand, the evidence was categorized as consensus not reached, but actually failed evidence with an N of 23 individuals. There were 34.7 who passed, along with the validity where they had said it was passed, but it was actually consensus not reached. Then in June 4 of 21, there was a revote on evidence after considering comments, and it achieved a 64.7% with a bar of 60%, and recommended for endorsement 19 of 23 or 82.6%. Then another error caused a revoting on validity, and June 28th has been presented. It did pass on validity with 12 of 16, 75%, endorsement, the same 75%. So there were a lot of process issues, and I'm sympathetic to the challenge that NQF staff have to determine quorums and voting and pass rates. But it's somewhat distressing that in this measure, we've kept revoting and revoting. Eventually, it passed, which gives me concern about things just basically regressing to the mean. Whether that should in some way influence the ongoing maintenance measure in this case or not is, I think, almost secondary to this issue of how many times do you have a measure go up for a consideration before you say, my God, this is really getting to be a problem, particularly given the measure failed fairly significantly on evidence the first go around. The comments and the subsequent discussion, which Dr. James has presented, I think was very mixed. The idea that this is simply a checkbox, if you will, that says, yes, I did this, and that's sufficient from an administrative data set, or looking at the records and being able to say, yes, I did this, that's enough, without looking at the appropriateness of medications, or in some cases, the multiple changes that could occur in medications from discharge to 30 days after. I think, as Dr. James has indicated, prompted the committee to urge CMS to come up with, or NCQA, I guess, is the originator, with better, more nuanced measures. The other concern, and I was a little bit puzzled, maybe Dr. James could shed more light, is that a JAMA article was referenced about the ability of reconciliation to change outcomes, but the cited article actually showed in elders that there was no influence of, no positive statistical influence on outcomes. So while this is a measure that feels good, and people certainly have argued that till we get something better, it's the best we have, and is helping people to get some initial information or data. I worry about, given our breadth of portfolio, that we pass, oh, well, this will be okay until we come up with something better. That said, the measure did pass, albeit with 75% in its final iteration. And the process imperfections or problems were adjudicated. And I'll leave it for the committee to decide, is this a measure that should be used at a plan level for accountability?
Thank you so much, Jeff. Dawn, I can see you thinking, do you want to respond to any of Jeff's comments before I open it up to the rest of the CSAC members?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Missy. I hate to talk process here because I'm just kind of new to this as a co-chair, but I think in the end, when we have a measure like this that is flawed, but widely used and does, in the mind of many experts, make a difference, but it needs to be made better, that the NQF needs to make it very clear that if this measure comes back in 3 or 5 years and there are not substantial improvements shown, it is a non-starter. I mean, we can't just, one of our roles, I think, on NQF panels and committees is to force improvement. And we need to take that responsibility seriously and push these measure developers perhaps out of their comfort zone to make them make these things better, so that we aren't just kind of going through the motions, as Jeff said. We are actually testing these things in our mind to see where they can be made better. Thank you.
If I might, I think in my experience on standing committees at CSAC, there has been no ability to set parameters around improvement in measurement. We're stuck with the measures we get. Okay, I can understand that. But I agree totally, John, that we should be able to take to task developers and have some accountability to address concerns that CSAC and or the committees have had, and expect a turnaround over a reasonable time and to see some addressing of the flaws or imperfections. And I don't see that built in our system right now, which I think is a real detriment to improving quality of care overall. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, John. Those are that was a really helpful dialogue. And Matt, just a note that might be helpful when we regroup as CSAC is, I think, I don't know, several meetings ago, we actually, when Iona Tarian was still co-chair for the Patient Safety Standing Committee, there was a conversation about doing some review of competing measures, because now there's many different medication reconciliation measures, both at the facility level, I apologize for the dogs, and the plan levels. And I don't know that we ever heard where that ended, but it may be helpful to try to find where that conversation went and bring some of those updates back to this group, just given this conversation. And Matt, I'm actually going to let you facilitate the next couple of minutes of dialogue from CSAC. I'm going to go shut my door. I'll be right back.
Sure, Missy, thanks. Great comments from Missy. And there has been work done previously related to medication reconciliation and looking at different types of measures for this. I will remind the group that any sort of competing measure discussion, according to our policies, other medication reconciliation measures must come through at the same time in order for a competing measure discussion to be held. So there has been some work looking at different measures for medication reconciliation, in which the NQF staff have engaged the Patient Safety Committee a few cycles ago. But again, there needs to be two measures that would be considered competing to come through the measure evaluation cycle at the same time to be evaluated as competing measures. But it's a good comment to take back as well for when other medication reconciliation measures come to the standing committee and subsequently to the CSAC, especially if they're doing it at the same time.
I think, Matt, one of the challenges is to close the loop on these discussions. And I would say in the past, while I think, the staff has been certainly well-intended, and there's been a lot of change in leadership, most of these discussions never come back to the level in which they're raised. And it would be fine just to say, no, we can't do this, or we've considered this, but it's not possible. But I'd say 90% of the time, maybe even 100% of the time, this sort of conversation dies in a vacuum. And I think that's a real opportunity for improvement overall at CSAC.
Thank you for the comments, Jeff, taking those into consideration as well. I appreciate that. And Missy, are you?
I am, and I apologize. Okay, I'm sorry. Rebecca actually just put a question in the chat. Is medication reconciliation ever considered to include de-prescribing as an action of meds review that has accountability in any complementary or competing NQF measures? I don't know if even anyone on NQF staff could answer that on the call without doing a little bit of research.
I mean, certainly don't some of the geriatric measures look at appropriate prescribing, de-prescribing, if you would?
So Missy, I see Mary Barton, who's from NCQA on the call. She's raised her hand. I will say that normally the CSAC, there's no formal role for developers related to CSAC discussions. I do see that Rebecca's question is really specific to potentially what's included or maybe excluded in this measure. So if the CSAC wishes to hear from the developer, I believe Mary Barton from NCQA, who has her hand raised now, is able to address any of those questions.
That would be
I mean,
great.
I think it's simple. This is just a comparison of what was prescribed on discharge and noting that you reviewed that and it's prescribed in the reconciliation to home or the other venues that are prescribed.
I'm just reflecting a little more on what Dr. James explained about the standing committee's discussion and what they thought reconciliation might mean versus what it does mean for purposes of this measure. So just trying to get a better handle on, just from the patient perspective, comparing lists doesn't deliver more quality care. You know, making sure that people are taking the right meds does. And I'm just trying to understand how that conversation of the standing committee then translated to, let's go ahead and approve this. And it may be because of the discussion we just had that there's limitations on we have to take the measures that we have. But I heard Dr. James explain that the standing committee itself discussed, you know, what does this really mean? And I may have misunderstood that.
Sure. So let's actually do this, Rebecca. I think that is a helpful comment and clarification. I would like Mary Barton, because she's here, to be able to just answer that one specific question. And then as a reminder, following that, it would be great to just get any additional comments, questions, or concerns from CSAC members. But Mary, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and address Rebecca's question, that would be wonderful.
Thanks so much. There's a lot of flexibility right now in what constitutes an appropriate medication reconciliation, and I feel your pain because I think that this is an area that we would love to have a higher bar measure and really look at the changes that are made or possibly look at the indications and the medications. Really, there's a lot of ways that this could go and be more rigorous. But for today, with the data that we have, this is the best step. And unfortunately, this measure is not yet at 95%. So I feel like we're kind of trying to go stepwise here. But for sure, a de-prescribing conversation is completely appropriate to have in the context of a discharge from a hospital when you're saying, you know, whether it's here's this thing you've been on for 10 years, but you actually don't need to be on it anymore, or because we're adding these 3 other meds. You know, that's entirely appropriate. And I do want to just make a plug for another measure that NCQA has recently designed, which is for de-prescribing of benzodiazepines in older adults, because the Beers criteria recommend that older adults should not be on benzodiazepines, and we, rather than saying, you know, nobody should be on them, we're trying to take a point of view that there are some people who are already on them, and so they should be tapered safely and make that move towards discontinuation in a tapered way. But that's not the measure that's under discussion today. Sorry.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, any additional questions, comments, concerns, specifically from my CSAC colleagues? I'm doing a quick face scan. Okay, seeing none, but I have some notes from Jeff, Rebecca, and others for some follow-on. I am going to ask Beth to actually come on now and give, oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I'm going to see if there are any public comments. So no additional comments from CSAC members. I'm going to pause and see if there are any public comments.
Any member of the public can raise their hand if you're using the WebEx feature. I believe there's a *6 feature to take yourself off mute. If you have any comments related to 0097 for the CSAC's consideration, now's the time to do so.
I don't see any, Matt.
Neither do I.
Okay. At this point, then I am going to turn it over to Beth to come on and give us all instructions for the vote. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, so we're going to vote on this measure. Mary, if you can pull up the poll everywhere, that would be great.
As that's being pulled up, I just want to circle back to Dan's original question around what constitutes passing. So it's greater than 60% of those voting need to vote in favor to uphold the standing committee's endorsement. So greater than 60% of the votes coming in. Sorry, Beth, go ahead.
CSAC members, please select your vote for NQF 0097 medication reconciliation post-discharge. Your choices are to uphold the standing committee's recommendation to endorse the measure, or you can do not uphold the recommendation, instead return it to the standing committee for reconciliation. Looking for 8 votes, I see 7 votes. If anyone's having difficulty, I see 8 votes. Mary can close the poll and share the results. On this vote for 0097, 7 CSAC members voted to uphold the standing committee's recommendation to endorse the measure. 1 CSAC member voted to not uphold the recommendation, instead return it to the standing committee for reconsideration. Therefore, 0097 is endorsed. Thank you very much. And I believe I turn it back to Matt.
Yes.
Could I just ask a technical question here for a moment?
Sure.
How long will the endorsement last? Since this was back in 20 that it was originally considered, and there was all the comments that we've had about the measure.
Yeah, great question, Jeff. Since this has now officially been endorsed with the CSAC approval of the standing committee recommendation, this measure will come back in its normal cycle as of from fall 2021, which would be in the next 3 years or 3 to 4 years. So that's when endorsement would be maintained for this measure. Now there are opportunities to pull the measure off cycle. So out of those 3 or 4 years, that would be if the measure substantially changes. So if the recommendations are substantial enough that there's a change in the results, for instance, or there's new specifications that come out that shape the measure, that would pull the measure outside of that 3 or 4 year cycle to come back to the standing committee earlier. In addition, if there is an appeal received, or if there's a member of the public that wishes to have the measure pulled off cycle due to new evidence that has come to light, that may also be where the measure could come back either to the appeals body after this CSAC meeting, or out of cycle, out of that 3 to 4 years, if there's new evidence that a member of the public submits to NQF for the standing committee's consideration, that could impact the original voting that occurred from the standing committee. So otherwise, it would come back through in the next 3 or 4 years, depending on the cycle.
So I just think that 4 years for a measure that's been in question since 20 is rather a long time to go for something that everyone agrees is not optimal. But I'll say my.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the comments. Oh, sorry, John, did you have anything final?
So can this committee ask for a shorter return time, or is it up to the standing committee, the Patient Safety Standing Committee, or NQF itself? Who makes the call?
Yeah. So a lot of process questions today. So to answer your question, John, the CSAC is able to send a measure back to the standing committee, which would go back in the next upcoming cycle. So that's one immediate way for a measure to be reconsidered, but there needs to be rationale as to why, and usually points to any process issues or other potential issues that are under the CSAC's purview. However, in this case, that did not happen. As you can see, the voting score is listed here, which is 88% passing. So it's above the 60% threshold. Another way, John, like I mentioned, is if a member from the public wants to submit that this measure should come back for early maintenance review due to new evidence that's come to light, or any potential unintended consequences as a result of the implementation of this measure. That could be considered by NQF and the standing committees for consideration of whether or not they need to come back through for an early maintenance review. Lastly, we have an appeals period, and any measure that is upheld as being endorsed goes through a 30-day appeals period after the CSAC meeting, in which case any member of the public may submit to appeal the measure or its decision from the CSAC in order to be potentially reconsidered. Those are the options. In this case, where we find ourselves today, so this measure has maintained endorsement, and moving forward, it will go into the appeals period. And outside of that, if no appeals have been received, it will come back through in the next 3 to 4 years, unless there's an early maintenance request that would constitute a standing committee review of the measure. I want to keep on moving, so we keep to our agenda here. Now we're at 1 o'clock. So thank you, Missy. Missy is now recused for the next series of measures up for discussion. So thank you as well, Jeff, for being the discussant of this measure. We'll now move to the remaining 3 measures up for discussion within the Patient Safety Standing Committee. You can see those listed there. Those are the 3 ECQM measures. Same measure, different level of analysis. And so Tammy as well will be leading out this discussion. Our lead discussant is going to be Rebecca Kirsch, and we also have additional discussants as Kelly Nedrow and Kevin Cavanaugh for these measures. So Tammy, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Matt. So the remaining 3 measures are listed in front of you for the patient safety discussion today. These measures are NQF 3633E, excessive radiation dose or inadequate image quality for diagnostic computed tomography in adults at the clinician level, NQF 3662E, excessive radiation dose or inadequate image quality for diagnostic computed tomography in adults at the clinician group level, and NQF 3663E, excessive radiation dose or inadequate image quality for diagnostic computed tomography in adults measured at the facility level. These are 3 new ECQMs, and they are intermediate outcome measures, and they're developed by Alara Imaging and the University of California at San Francisco. These new measures were evaluated by the Patient Safety Standing Committee, and all 3 measures were recommended for endorsement. They are not included in the consent calendar as they did not meet criterion number 2, which identifies whether there were any process concerns that may have affected the endorsement decision. In addition, NQF 3633E did not meet criterion 1, as the overall suitability for endorsement vote was 78.9% passing. These measures were reviewed by the Scientific Methods Panel, and the SMP passed all 3 measures on reliability and validity. During the measure evaluation meeting, the Standing Committee recommended all 3 measures for endorsement. During the post-comment meeting, NQF received 2 public comments that applied to all 3 of the measures. One comment applying to all 3 measures was in support of the Standing Committee's recommendation and additionally requested the development of exclusion criteria for overuse. The developer provided a public response addressing this request and clarifying why this is not necessary based on the construction of their measure, and stating that the comment actually reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the measure. The second comment also applied to all 3 measures, and it was in opposition to the Standing Committee's recommendation, restating concerns from a pre-evaluation comment that had been submitted and stating that they didn't feel the Standing Committee adequately considered that pre-evaluation comment in the original measure evaluation meeting. The Standing Committee discussed this comment during the post-comment call. While the NQF measure review process was followed, in reconsidering this comment, several Standing Committee members had concerns that their review may not have been thorough enough due to lack of expertise among the committee members, since the radiology expert on the committee was recused from discussion and voting on these measures. One Standing Committee member noted that when a professional society comments on a measure, it should be strongly considered. However, this same member also stated that they thought all the issues were well considered during the original meeting and that the overall vote for endorsement should stand. It was also noted that many comments in support of the measure were also received at the time of this original comment before the measure evaluation meeting. The committee suggested that in the future, for similar technical measures on very specialized subject matter, a technical expert panel might be convened to help review some of the measure's nuances, similar to how the SMP reviews, but subject specific. The standing committee was given the option to vote on the following three options. First, the standing committee could agree that the measures met all the NQF criteria and vote to stand by their recommendation to endorse the measures. Second, the standing committee could re-vote on the measures endorsement or on a specific criterion based on a credible rationale that criteria were not met. Or three, the standing committee could vote to postpone further review and NQF could create a technical expert panel to provide additional expert feedback to the standing committee. The majority of standing committees present, which was 11 of 14 members, 78.6%, voted to uphold its recommendation to endorse the measures. Therefore, no subsequent votes were held, and the standing committee's recommendation to endorse all three measures stands. I would now like to invite the patient safety co-chair, Dr. John James, to share his perspective on these measures.
Yeah, I think, Tammy, you did a great job of describing the events that led up to where we are now. Thank you. I think it reflects my feeling that the NQF process, while it's perhaps a bit laborious, is very thorough, and we followed it, and we listened, and we got different opinions on the committee. Most of us weren't experts in this kind of area, but we listened hard to the experts who talked to us, both pro and con, and we ultimately decided by a large majority that this was fit to be endorsed. So there's not much to say beyond that, except that we really did do, I think, due diligence with this one. And by the way, the other two measures did pass the 80% that you guys are using today to put it on a separate pile. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Great, thanks, John. Thank you very much, Tammy. So at this time, I'll welcome our lead discussant, Rebecca, to provide any additional remarks or based on her summary of these three measures.
I appreciate it all. That's such a nice hug. I think we all needed that at this time of day, John. I can be brief because the deliberations, the discussion as outlined were very thorough. And what I particularly appreciated from the patient and caregiver perspective in what the standing committee even talked about social risk factors and whether there's impact there, which is very important for us to keep seeing happen, as CSAC has talked about and the MAP committee has talked about the importance of equity in deliberations as we look ahead for NQF. I think in particular, they discussed a great deal around the harmonization. Could these three measures somehow be condensed? And the developer had acceptable answers around the importance of attribution across these three different care quality areas that were distinct. So I did not detect anything that would cause us to upend what the standing committee suggested. So I'll defer to my other discussants, my co-discussants, for any other comments.
Thanks, Rebecca. Kelly or Kevin, any additional comments or thoughts?
Yes, I've got some. If I'm could go. I'm somewhat concerned about these measures and whether or not the validity and the specifics of the medical society's concerns were taken into consideration for these metrics. The previous discussion nor the information provided by NQF actually truly delineated what these concerns were. And I had to do some research myself, and I do feel that they're valid concerns and that these measures, if not thoroughly discussed and, by the committee and understood by the committee, have the potential of possibly doing harm. The reason is in the discussion when they talk about these measures are actually talking about the type of test, et cetera, and you need to focus on that. That is really code for when you measure radiation with CAT scans, you're really talking about the number of slices used. The CAT scanners are, from my understanding, are pretty much comparable to radiation delivered. And after you adjust for patient factors, which I believe these metrics do, you are then left with how many slices do you order? What is the distance between the slice? This determines, this is the major driver in dosage. If you double the number of slices, you will either see a wider area or you get a much better image quality and are able to better pick up lesions. And so this is what they mean is it will possibly drive the type of test that's done. There's no control that I could see in the denominator for number of slices or distance between the slices. And if indeed you have a metric that's just measuring radiation, and you're now financially incentivizing people to lower radiation, and the best way they can do that is to limit slices, you may have the unintended outcome of creating lower quality testing and having lesions missed. Now, I didn't obviously hear all the testimony or go through everything, but that's the key question. And what disturbs me is that with NQF, with the presentation, the standing committee, what's been presented so far, no one's really talked about that. Does the denominator need to take into account number of slices so that we get out of image quality types of concerns? Or does it not have to do that? Otherwise, you're dictating really the type of CT that you're getting. And of course, you also have the with and without contrast CT where you just double everything, doing a separate test that maybe isn't even needed. So all of those are, I think, are major concerns. And I'm really wondering if the standing committee actually considered the comments, because the comments weren't really written in an explicit way to explain these factors. They seem to be more global terms that could be overlooked by the standing committee. But in view of a metric that could cause potential harm or unforeseen outcomes, I think if the standing committee has mentioned they didn't have the expertise in reviewing this, I really think they need to reconsider and get the expertise and do a more in-depth look at the metric. And that's my overall comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So just confirming, and maybe we can go back to John on this one after we hear from others on the CSAC, but just confirming that the concern was really, did the comments received really get considered by the standing committee? So the comments that were submitted, did they really get fully evaluated and considered by the standing committee, noting some of the concerns that were in those comments?
That's correct. And if they actually understood the comments, the impact, and whether or not the denominator should or should not be changed to look at number of CT scan slices that is being ordered, and getting that out of the measurement. As I said, I think it's too superficial. I don't think they've addressed the comments. These are professional societies, and the radiologists I've talked to readily understood the problem. And this is in a situation where there is actually no standardization of types of tests. Every patient's different, and a lot of times it depends upon the ordering physician. Yep. So that's the concern.
Thank you, Kevin. So before I go back to John on that one around how the comments were considered, I'll see if our other co-discussant, Kelly, if you have anything to add before I open up to the CSAC overall.
I noted, of course, from a non-clinical perspective, some of the same things that Kevin brought up. If the goal of the measure is to reduce patient exposure to radiation, and this is coming from a non-clinical perspective, I think the concerns that come up for me are if low image quality is, a possibility, then, having to, have additional testing, which is additional exposure to radiation, is a concern, as well as additional costs for patients due to having to have multiple procedures or images taken. Those were my points that I've noted.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Anyone else from the CSAC wish to provide any additional comments related to these three measures and what's been discussed thus far?
Yeah, one question or concern, and I saw it on one of the measures that is on our consent calendar that I was engaged with, is having the appropriate and robust technical expertise on a panel. And I think for things like RT or some of the pathology markers and such that we saw in the primary care, there is not as broad and robust technical expertise as I might like in any case. I'll just reflect on the consideration of the pathology markers that were considered in our primary care group. Primary care doesn't usually consider that sort of stuff, and we can certainly consider some of the aspects of a measure, but there were only 2 or 3 individuals who really had any technical expertise whatsoever. And it wasn't like you could just read up on it right away and try to figure it out. So I guess the bottom line is maybe there needs to be some process to add additional technical experts when we consider something that is very specialized, like RT exposure for CTs, so that the very people who might have the expertise have to recuse themselves. And then we get into this whole question of, well, were the technical issues considered adequately? That's my only comment.
Thanks, Jeff. So a comment here around, again, the technical expertise needed for the standing committee to make evaluations on these measures, which, as Tammy summarized, this was a discussion that the standing committee had, and also even further determined through a vote on how they would like to proceed, given the concerns that were discussed within the standing committee. And they voted to proceed with endorsing the measures as they have reviewed them. Anyone else from the the CSAC have any additional comments before maybe turning it back to John for any remarks on these issues? Okay, so John, I guess just those comments you've been hearing around how the standing committee really handled the comments that have been received for these measures, and really some of that technical expertise area of concern. Do you have anything you'd like to respond to related to those comments?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Matt. Kevin, I think I understand your comment. And if I understand the way all this works, and of course my knowledge is limited, but if you put in a request for a high density, that is a lot of slices, CT scan, the radiation is going to be higher. And so that the idea that you have to independently deal with the number of slices versus the overall radiation dose, I think is not necessary. That is, the number of slices is reflected in the overall dose. So you might want to rebuttal on that. By the way, Kevin, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you for a long time.
Well, thank you. Well, it is reflected in the overall dose, and that's why controlling the dose will drive how many slices you have. And the less slices, the less clarity of the image you'll have.
Right.
I've experienced this quality with CT scans on earwork, on the temporal bone, where we need a very high quality image. I couldn't get the radiologist to give me enough quality image that I could see the inner ear structures for surgery. We ended up doing, I think, 2 or 3 CT scans on the gentleman. So it is, you put in a financial incentive on top of that, you're going to drive down image quality, and that's the adverse effect. And if you drive down image quality, you're going to miss things. If you take a slice once every, 5 millimeters, you're not going to be able to pick up small lesions or have maybe the resolution you need for surgery.
And thank you, Kevin, for
anyway,
that level of detail. Appreciate that. Sorry to cut you off on that one. I just a reminder that sort of the issues here are really looking at how the standing committee really addressed the comments or considered those comments as was summarized by Tammy and John, and just the consideration of that technical expertise. So the reminder that re-adjudicating a lot of the standing committee decision making would not be under the purview of the CSAC. However, just the consideration of those comments and how that factored into the evaluation is what is being considered today, as well as that technical expertise. And thank you very much for that. And John, do you have any other comments you'd like to add?
Yes, I'd like to respond to the comment that Kelly raised. We did worry, if that's the right word, about the concern you raised about having to do repeat scans because the resolution was too low because you used too low radiation dose. Okay, and when we asked that question, the developer cited a study where only about 11% of the time was a repeat scan necessary when this measure was applied. Now, I don't like that, but that tells me that it's being done pretty well, that the radiologists are picking a dose of radiation that is at the threshold for the quality of scan they need, that is the number of slices, if you will, and the risk that it's going to have to be repeated because they don't see what they want to see. I might also point out, if there's such a thing as an incidentaloma, and sometimes you find what you probably shouldn't have found because it really isn't making a difference. But that's a technical side. I don't want to go there. But I think we really did go through the process and discussion and engage the people as best we could that we felt knew what was going on. It is an ongoing issue. Did we have enough expertise available to really look at this measure?
Yeah, but John, if you have to repeat 11% of your CT scans in an optimal setting, that's pretty high.
I agree, Kevin.
And that's in an optimal setting of universities that have top-notch people that aren't financially driven. You add a financial incentive on top of that. I mean, 11% is high. These are expensive tests that have radiation exposure.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, John. I want to see if Tammy, the Director of Patient Safety Standing Committee, has any additional comments to add. And then we'll do one final round of CSAC comments and discussion before we open up for public comment, which I know the developer of this measure is on the call and most likely has some comments to share for the CSAC. So Tammy, do you have anything you would like to add?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I just wanted to know in response to these concerns also that we took steps in this subsequent cycle, spring 2022, to call in additional subject matter experts to help the committee when recusals were a potential issue on nuanced concerns. So just from a process and have for future reviews to resolve them. But again, that doesn't apply to the standing committee reviewed the comments and their own discussion on their own and made the decision to stand by their endorsement decision.
Thanks, Tammy. Thank you. Any final comments from the CSAC before we open it up for public comment? Okay. All right, thank you. Public comment is now open. So if any members of the public would like to provide comments to these measures and the discussion being held currently on these measures by the CSAC, now's the opportunity to do so. You can raise your hand and we'll call in order as we receive them, And I see Rebecca Smith-Bidman, you have your hand raised, and I believe you are representing the developer. Is that correct?
I am. Thank you for the chance to speak. I am a radiologist and epidemiologist, and I've been a faculty member at UCSF for 25 years. For the last 15 years, my primary area of research has been in quantifying the radiation doses used for CT scanning and identifying ways to appropriately reduce excessive doses. I developed the measure with my team, and the 3 measures that you reviewed today are all essentially the same with a different level of attribution. I want to first correct that 11% number that was just spoken. We shared results from 2 evaluations. One, we prospectively evaluated the ECQM across 16 hospitals, 1 large outpatient radiology group, and in that testing data, we assembled 50,000 CT scans from those organizations. In those 50,000 CT scans, a small fraction, less than 1%, I think it was 0.3%, were deemed as having poor image quality, a very, very small number of actual scans. The 11% number is a number that was evaluated as part of our measure. We created a test set of images, 750 CTs assembled from a dozen institutions. And for those, we assembled a lot of low dose exams because we did a radiology reader study. In that set of 750 CTs that were evaluated by 125 radiologists, in that test set assembled to be overrepresentative of very low doses where we thought there could be a quality issue, that's where the 11% came from. But in real practice, it was a fraction of 1%. I want to help you understand the quality gap that led us to create the measure. Around 90 million CT scans are performed every year in the US, meaning the equivalent of 1 in 4 Americans is imaged with CT scanning each year. Thus, the measure will impact a significant portion of the US population. We developed this measure because they observed an extremely large variation in the radiation doses that are used for CT scanning. The doses that are used for particular types of scan, for example, an abdominal CT to evaluate a patient for right lower quadrant pain. This is bread and butter radiology. The doses that are used for that vary tremendously depending on where the patient goes for the CT. Meaning one patient might get a dose of 3 millisievert, and 3 millisievert is the equivalent amount of radiation that's typically received as part of annual background exposure in the United States from the sun and earth. So you could get a dose of 3 millisievert. You also could go to a different institution for the same symptom and get a dose of 30 millisievert, or even go to another institution and have a dose of 100 millisievert, all for the scan done for the same reason. So 3, 30, 100 for the same scan. And my evidence of this is based on analysis of 15 million scans that my team has assembled from across 160 hospitals. The variation in the dose is not driven by patient factors such as how large the patient or why the scan is being done. Yes, you need different doses for different indications, but that is not what drives the variation, nor is it driven by the type or age of machines, but rather by local decisions that are made about the details of the machine settings. It turns out that slice thickness per se is not an important parameter, but the number of phases is, the MAS KVPR. I want to make clear that, again, patient size, the indication for scanning, and the machine all influence dose, but they don't drive the variation. The variation remains after accounting for these factors. I also want to emphasize that appropriately dosed scans can be obtained in all patients and all machine types, which my team has demonstrated in an NIH-funded randomized controlled trial across 100 hospitals, that providing audit feedback to imaging facilities about their doses can achieve meaningful and standardized dose reduction without impacting image quality. The measure is provided in such a way that it will give feedback the same as that was given in our trial. And there is currently no evidence that image quality is a problem. I mentioned that as part of our radiologist reader study, where 125 physicians rated the image quality of selected exams from a low dose, and this was not a big problem. In actual practice, a small fraction of 1% of scans in testing were rated as had unacceptable image quality, but 33% of doses exceeded the maximum that were established as part of the measure. So there's a large safety problem with radiation dose. and no image safety problem with image quality. We are super aware of the potential for any measure to lead to unintended consequences, and we are also aware of concerns that have been expressed about our approach for measuring image quality. I want to emphasize that this measure is not primarily intended as a robust measure of image quality, but to ensure a minimum level of quality that correlates with physician satisfaction. And if the measure is used by CMS, we'll be closely monitoring image noise and other measures of image quality during the process of assembling data, and will be very sensitive to any signal that there is a problem, and will revise the measure if it turns out we need to make changes. I wanted to just tell you one more thing about our approach to developing the measure. We systematically set forth principles that we thought were important for making a state-of-the-art measure, and I think this will answer a concern that was raised about the choice of how to scan, whether you get the scans that you want and appropriate image quality. First, the measure covers all body regions and all types of scans, including high-dose exams, multiple phase, that are needed for certain clinical questions. Second, the primary focus was on dose, but we also had a measure to account for image quality. And third, and this is the part that I think is subtle but really important, that it covers the two key process of care components that determine the radiation dose. These include the choice of imaging protocol, or in layman's terms, the type of scan. For example, whether a patient with suspected pulmonary embolism is imaged with single or double phase scan. This decision is made by the radiologist, and then separate decisions regarding the technical settings used for the type of CT scan, which are at the discretion of the technologist. Both contribute to radiation dose. And in our measurement, we decide what the clinical indication was, not based on what the radiologist chose to do, but rather what the ordering provider indicated was necessary. So if the patient needs a high resolution internal ear exam, that's the criteria that we evaluate that measure. And that exam would be put in a high dose category. So it would be allowed a higher dose than if the scan was done for sinus disease, where you need a low quality image to look for sinus infection. I think I will end by just saying we engaged a very diverse and expert stakeholder group for our technical expert panel, including leadership from the American College of Radiology, the president and chief medical officer of Radiology Partners, one of the largest radiology groups in the nation, representation from Leapfrog, the director of quality measurement at the Joint Commission, the chief medical and scientific officer of the American Cancer Society, the executive vice president at United Health Group, and a medical physicist who previously served as president of the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, as well as the Society for Imaging Informatics, and who serves as governor of the American Board of Radiology. So the TEP also had representation from other specialty societies, urology, emergency medicine, cardiology, several additional radiologists, and many individuals with methodological expertise in measure development, electronic health record extraction, as well as reporting. So while I appreciate there may not have been complete expertise at every level of evaluation at NQF, those levels of expertise were carefully considered, the measure modified in response to the entire development process, which went over a 3-year period. Thank you very much for considering our measure.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Any other comments from the public related to these 3 measures, which is the same measure but different levels of accountability? Now's your opportunity to provide comments. Okay. Okay. Hearing none and seeing no other hands raised, again, as a reminder, we did not have quorum for this measure, so unfortunately we're not able to vote on the call today. The vote will occur through a offline survey, which will be sent out to the state, to this CSAC after we adjourn today. For just some suggestion here for those CSAC members on the call today is to please jot down your decision on this measure. The questions that you will be asked, or which you will be whether you want to uphold the standing committee's recommendation to endorse these measures. So you'll be voting on those individually in that offline survey. So please jot down the numbers for these measures and your decision. And again, these measures are 3633E, 3662E, and 3663E. Again, the survey will, or that offline voting survey will be sent out after the call. So please just keep track of your decisions. Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, John. We'll now go to our last measure for discussion today. Again, we don't have quorum on this measure either, so it will be offline voting as well, but the CSAC will still discuss the measure and the issues that will be presented. I'll turn it back to Missy, who is not recused from this measure now, to take it over from here and introduce Paula Farrell, the director of the PCCI team.
Thanks so much, Matt. Paula, are you with us?
I am, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, and we will turn it over to you for a description.
Okay, great. Thank you. So for the fall 2021 cycle, we had one measure that was not included in the consent calendar, and this measure was NQF number 3667, days at home for patients with complex chronic conditions, and its summary can be found on page 9 of the CSAC discussion guide. The developer for this measure is Yale New Haven Health Services Corporation. And this was a new outcome measure that was evaluated by the Primary Care and Chronic Illness Standing Committee. So NQF number 3667 is not included in the consent calendar as it did not meet criteria 1. The measure was not recommended for endorsement by the PCCI Standing Committee. Therefore, it did not receive 80% or greater passing votes for overall suitability for endorsement. And the reason being is that the measure did not pass on validity, which is a must-pass criteria. The measure was initially reviewed by the Scientific Methods Panel, and they did not initially reach consensus on validity. The Standing Committee highlighted that the S&P's main concerns with validity pertain to the risk adjustment models, measure exclusions, and meaningful differences in performance. And in reviewing the validity of the measure, the Standing Committee noted that the developer conducted face validity and construct validity testing. While the face validity testing indicated that the measure may be valid, the construct validity testing found that the correlation between this measure and other measures was weak. And there was a Pearson's rank correlation that ranged from 0.549 to 0.048. The developer did emphasize that the lack of correlation may be due to the other measures having smaller sample sizes and not being risk adjusted. Also raised concerns that the risk adjusted models have no standardized approach to address social determinants of health factors. The Standing Committee highlighted that the S&P's concerns with regarding the measure exclusions, regarding low outliers, and how the developer attributed them to unintended consequences of the measure's construct, as the measure attempts to balance days at home with other unintended consequences. The Standing Committee also highlighted the S&P's concerns with meaningful differences in performance and the use of the measure for quality improvement purposes. Specifically, they questioned whether the measure can be used to identify differences in patient function or health-related quality of life. And the Standing Committee agreed that these concerns were significant enough to threaten the validity of the measure. Therefore, the Standing Committee did not pass the measure on validity. During our post-comment period, NQF did receive 2 commenters that expressed support for the Standing Committee's decision to not recommend the measure for endorsement, citing concerns with the measure's validity. We also received 3 comments in opposition of the Standing Committee's recommendation, citing that the measure is an important metric in managing patients at home and one that patients also care about. One commenter that was also in support of the measure for endorsement did note, though, that there were challenges that exist to the operationalizing the measure, including concerns about access to care, a perceived lack of control to make changes by those being held accountable, and the ability of claim-based measures to make effective reactive reactions and to improve care. The developer of the measure also submitted a comment clarifying aspects of the measure, and they did request that the standing committee provide feedback on potential enhancements to the measure. And during our post-comment call, the standing committee did draft 3 recommendations for the measure to developer to consider for improvements. 1, the standing committee recommended introducing a survey instrument or a patient-reported outcome measure that would assess factors which may affect the quality of care and feasibility of care being provided at home. 2, the standing committee recommended that the developer focus on assessment of the measure on the continuum of care versus a specific location being at home. And then 3rd, the standing committee recommended that dual eligibility risk identifiers is not an accurate capture of social determinant of health factors. And not all patients who are able to receive care at home are dual eligible, and this could potentially penalize a provider. Additionally, the standing committee advised that there were significant policy variations in Medicaid from state to state, which also impact entity level social determinant of health factors. So the standing committee discussed all of these comments that were received during the post-comment call and ultimately decided to uphold their recommendation not to endorse the measure due to the validity concerns, as the standing committee concluded that the developer's approach to risk adjustment was not sufficient. So at this point, I'd like to invite our PCCI co-chairs, Dale Bratzler and Adam Thompson, to also share their perspective on the measure.
Thanks, Paula. This is Dale Bratzler at University of Oklahoma. So we did do a very long, detailed discussion of this particular measure. Paula has done just an outstanding job of highlighting the concerns that were raised by the committee and the comments that we received in the post-comment meeting that we had. I think I would boil down a lot of our concerns about the particular measure that the risk adjustment, particularly for social determinants, simply wasn't adequate to make any of us feel comfortable that days at home for chronic conditions was a measure that could be equitably applied across multiple different health settings, rural, urban settings, different types of healthcare settings, for patient care. And so, again, the Yale New Haven team did a great job of their discussion of all the things that they had done to build the measure. Again, they used dual eligibility, Medicare, Medicaid dual eligibility as the primary evaluation of the social issues for a particular patient, but we went through a long list of other things that our committee, many in primary care and others, that may impact the decision about whether a patient is able to receive care at home or needs to be in some other setting. I want to point out there was a lot of confusion initially that patients who are living in a nursing home, that is considered home. And so they did not fail the particular performance measure, but it's all the other settings that a patient may be in that could fail the measure. So Paula did it, like I say, did a great job of highlighting all of the conversation. It was quite a lengthy conversation, but it really fundamentally came down to, can we adequately adjust for all of the factors that may support or not support a patient actually living in the home setting?
And is Adam on the line?
Yes, I don't see him.
I don't believe he is able to.
Adam may not be available.
After 2, so I don't believe he's on the line.
Okay, Paula and Dr. Bratzler, thank you so much. For CSAC, Dana Sear is the lead discussant. I know she is here. So I will turn it over.
I am here. And I have to tell you that, as I read this and saw the concerns, and I was kind of noting some of the concerns about this, which I thought there were some significant concerns, especially not incorporating the social determinants of health as a risk factor. And I really, based on my personal experience, feel that dual eligibility it cannot be used. as a substitute for looking at social determinants of health. I would say that among the individuals we serve, which is the home and community-based waiver population, about 48% of the people we serve are elders, and those are oftentimes not people who had struggled due to any social determinants of health. They're people who've run out of their money to pay for their care, or they're people who were successfully able to divest their income. And so I think you just have too much variation among that population to think that you could use that as as an indicator of social determinants of health. The other thing that I thought was really concerning was actually using this as a measure of care coordination. And primarily because what we're seeing right now is that we cannot get people out of hospitals or nursing homes because of the direct care workforce crisis. We just can't find places for people to even discharge to in the community setting. And I don't think an ACO would have any control over that. And so I agreed with the committee that that this was not a valid, that it didn't pass the validity test, and I just don't think it would be a good measure. And I have to say that I went back and I looked at the comments for this, and I did see that there were a number of disability advocates who see this as a way of sort of really emphasizing how important it is for people to be able to receive care at home. I just don't think this is the measure that's going to get them there. So.
Thank you, Dana. That was an excellent summary, and I really appreciate your personal commentary on that as well. I think it really added some color to this entire discussion, so thank you so much. The additional discussants for this measure are Dan Kalika and Laura Pennington. I'm actually going to go to Dan first to see if he has anything additional to add, but I don't. Oh, I do see him. Dan?
Yeah, I'm here, Missy. Thank you. I would say that I can see the merit of the measure. I mean, I understand the pitfalls, and I think that in a way I was surprised that the only issue that has been found was with the construct validity, and I personally didn't see very much of a proof in that regard. I mean, there is a mentioning that it was evaluated by comparing with other measures, and I would say that looking for the description in the manual, that it says that the other NQF measure that it's comparable, it's risk standardized acute admission rates for patients with multiple chronic conditions. I don't know if this is the measure that has been compared to, but this one is an admission rate while this one is days at home. So I don't see very much the similarity between the two measures. But again, there might be details that have been missed that I obviously missed. Other issues, I would say that when the measure is described, it says that it applies to, hold on, here, it's yeah, the measure is designed to look at the days at home. So and it actually explains that it's designed for that. But then when I look at the measure, it says the level of the setting of care, it says post-acute care, inpatient, and hospital care. So there are some discrepancies there, and then on the issue of social determinants of health, the measure is described as adjusting for clinical and social risk factors. And then when a more detailed analysis looked into and concluded that combination between, I mean, the use of dual eligibles was used as a proxy for social determinants of health. there are some discrepancies between, I would say, the final conclusions and the overall evaluation and what it's actually written down about the measure. So I would say that, again, I was surprised that the construct validity was the only issue that has been found with the measure. But I can see the merit of it, and I can see why it has been pushed, and I can see why CMS would have liked to do that and see it being brought in, especially with this transition to accountable care now that it's embraced.
Thank you so much, Dan. Those are great additional comments. Laura, do you have anything additional to add?
Not really. I agree with my colleagues that I really appreciate the intent behind this measure, but also recognize the difficulties with it and hope that the measure developers can improve this and bring it back in the future for consideration, especially as we get more sophisticated with collecting social determinants of health data. I know we're still kind of in the early days of that in some ways, and so agree that using the dual population as a proxy is not as effective as I think really trying to figure out how to do this and do it well. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. That was actually a great overview from everyone. Thank you, Dana and Dan and Laura. That was fantastic. Does any other additional CSAC member have any comments, questions, or concerns? Okay, so is Matt, oh, I'm sorry. Are there any public comments? Is there anyone on the line that would like to share a public comment? And Matt, I don't know if you can give those instructions again if folks are on mute.
Sure. So thank you all to the CSAC for the consideration and discussion of this measure has been presented. Now is the opportunity for members of the public to provide any comments related to this measure. That's NQF 3667. So if you have a comment you'd like to share for the CSAC's consideration, now's the opportunity to do so. You can use the raise hand feature and we'll call on you as recognized, or there's the *6 option to take yourself off mute as well.
I see Mary's hand now. Oh, Mary, did you mean to raise your?
Yeah, I think Mary's on the NQF staff side. I think she took it down.
Okay, I knew she was, but I'm like, maybe she has a question.
Yeah. Any other members of the public wish to make any comments? I don't see any hands raised, Missy, or not hearing anyone else.
Either. So as a reminder, we won't be voting on this measure today. We will be voting on this measure when we get the SurveyMonkey or the online link. And just to reiterate, to uphold the standing committee's decision in this case would be to uphold their decision to not recommend the measure for endorsement. Okay, no additional questions, concerns. Great. I'll turn it back over to you, Matt. Thanks so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Missy. Thank you, Dale, as well, our co-chair of the Patient Primary Care and Chronic Illness Standing Committee. Thank you, Paula, as well. As Missy said, since we didn't achieve quorum for this measure, voting would happen offline through that survey. And as Missy also said, as an important reminder, the question you'll be asked is whether you want to uphold the Standing Committee's decision to not recommend this measure for endorsement. So keeping that in mind. So if you do wish to reverse that decision, there'll be a text box in that survey that will ask you to determine why you think it should be endorsed, right? So that survey will be sent out after this call. But now that concludes all of our discussions of the measures for fall 2021. So since no measures were pulled for discussion from the consent calendar, that hour block from 2 to 3 has been canceled. So I'll ask Mary to pull up the slides once again. Now we'll move to the overall public comment. So this is for any of the proceedings that have happened today, whether consent calendar or any of the measures that have been discussed. If any member of the public would like to voice any comments for the CSAC's consideration, now is the opportunity to do so. Like I said, you could take your hand, raise your hand. We'll call in the order as we see it, or take yourself off mute and share your comments. So we'll just pause for a few seconds for public comment. Again, last call here for the opportunity for anyone from the public to share comments on any of the proceedings that have happened today for the CSAC's consideration. You can use the raise hand feature or take yourself off mute. Public comment. Okay, seeing none and hearing none, I want to thank everyone again for the proceedings today. We will go through our next steps and just remind folks of the survey before we adjourn the call. So Mary, I'll turn it over to you to conduct our next steps today.
So for our next steps, the voting results will be posted in early August. This date will change a little because of offline voting. So once all offline voting is complete, this voting results document will be posted very shortly after. We also have our meeting summary from today's meeting, so that will be posted in September. Additionally, the appeals period, this also may shift slightly because of the offline voting. So it will still be held in August, but those exact dates might shift by a few days there until that offline voting is complete. And then final CDP technical reports will be posted in November of this year. Additionally, any resources or today's materials, those are all available on our project webpage, our CSAC page on the NQF website. And then any additional questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to our csac@qualityforum.org email, and we're happy to address anything that way as well. And Matt, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. And before we adjourn, I also want to just thank this CSAC once again for piloting this new approach with a consent calendar. We very much are looking forward to doing some feedback on this process with this CSAC when we convene them next. In addition, want to really be appreciative and sensitive to the comments that have been shared related to other issues that have been presented to the CSAC, as well as what the CSAC continues to see, and which there are areas to work with this CSAC moving forward. Part of the reasoning for doing the consent calendar is to try to reduce a lot of the time on reviewing measures that didn't require a lot of discussions, to have more of these strategic discussions with the CSAC, which we are very much looking forward to do moving forward as well. So I'm mentioning a lot of comments that have been expressed by this CSAC today, but also in previous meetings as well, related to things around reserve status, as well as the public reporting. So those are not lost on NQF on our task list to do for the CSAC. So please know that that's something we look to engage the CSAC in the months ahead. But thank you all very much to the developers, to our CSAC. Missy, thank you for your leadership, and also the members of the public and the CSAC team for all of their work today. Missy, do you have any final closing remarks before we adjourn?
No, I just want to thank the staff and my CSAC colleagues for hanging in there for this pilot today. I think it actually went really smoothly. So thank you, everyone. And you get like 90 minutes back to your day. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Great. That's right. Thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon and great rest of your week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.